Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Europe. Slovenia's largest supermarket chain, called Mercator, boycotted Israel. This is a major victory for the BDS movement and a significant loss for Israel. Slovenia is a state that emerged from the former country of Yugoslavia. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. Its objective is to isolate Israel in the international arena. It has a strong presence on college campuses in the United States and is very powerful in Europe. Israeli products were taken off the shelves at Mercator. Before the boycott, Slovenia primarily imported citrus products from Israel, fruits like pomelos, oranges, limes, lemons, as well as avocados and dates. What made this decision by the Slovenian supermarket even more devastating is that the state of Slovenia itself is a significant shareholder in the national food chain, although they claim that the state divested all interest in the chain just several months ago. Israel saw the writing on the wall and increased diplomatic pressure on Slovenia to prevent this decision from happening, but they failed. This Slovenian boycott did not concern itself with products from the West Bank, for instance. This policy, which is framed by the BDS, addresses all products imported from Israel, all of Israel. BDS and its boycott have even been rejected by Mahmoud Abbas. The Palestinian leader recommends a boycott of West Bank products, not products from all of Israel. BDS is more extreme than the Palestinians. Boycotts of this nature violate international law. But this is not about law. BDS is about hatred and bile and anger. It's about attacking Israel's very right to exist. The boycott is illegal under EU law. So, just a few days after the boycott, I was happy to see that Mercator, the Slovenian supermarket that was boycotting Israeli fruits, rescinded that boycott and placed a new order for Israeli produce. The Slovenian government officially responded saying that there was never a boycott. This is an important defeat for BDS, but BDS will continue to try to get more European countries to boycott Israel. In the end, it was also a huge victory for Israel and a victory for justice. Also in Europe, Iran's President Rouhani visited Europe for nearly an entire week during the end of January. Rouhani went to buy planes and court investors. Investors are rushing to Iran. For example, during the week immediately after sanctions were lifted, over $50 billion in foreign investments poured into Iran. Rouhani knows what he needs. He has a shopping list. Rouhani visited Rome for 2 days and then Paris. Iran has ordered 114 Airbus planes, including the Jumbo 380, the 320, and of course the A321 from France. That comes to a total of $18 billion. Iran needs to renew their passenger fleet, which has not been updated for nearly 4 decades. Airbus is a French company. Boeing, the Seattle-based US company, would really like to supply Iran too. So in addition, Iran wants to add at least 20 new regional planes to their list. The best supplier of these regional jets is Can Air Bombardier. They are actually a Canadian company. The weekend before he departed for Europe, Iran hosted 300 guests from various airplane companies, luring them back into the Iranian market. Iran is becoming a serious consumer. They have the need and they have the cash. Any supplier is going to want to step up and bid to get their business. In case you have any doubts, sanctions against Iran are a thing of the past. Iran is moving on. Iran is at a critical stage in history and is going to the polls. Important elections will be held in Iran on February 26th. We should watch them carefully. The elections are for parliament and for the assembly of experts. The parliament in Iran is also known, or better translated, as the Assembly of Representatives. In Persian, it's called the Majlis, or the People's House. It's composed of 290 members from 31 provinces and 65 districts. Elections for the Assembly of Experts is far more significant than even the Majlis, the parliament. It is the experts who choose the supreme leader. The Assembly of Experts is composed of 88 Islamic experts. Over the years, the numbers of experts in the Assembly has actually varied from 82 to 88. The purpose of the Assembly is not political, although it's supposed to hold a check against the supreme leader. It appoints the supreme leader and can also remove him if necessary. The Assembly is divided into two sections: traditional conservatives and hardline conservatives. The future of Iran and the direction it takes will be determined on February 26th. They will be heated elections. I anxiously await the results. Coming up, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is an editorial from the New York Times. It's dated January 22nd, 2016, and it's bylined the editorial board. Remember, the editorials are unsigned, and they're the product of a board that meets and discusses them. They are a team of seasoned thinkers and leaders. This one is particularly problematic. It embraces and furthers a speech made by the United States Ambassador to Israel, Daniel Shapiro. Both the Times and Shapiro consider themselves friends of Israel. But this editorial shows their bias and how friends can be unfair in their critique. My reaction to them is righteous indignation. How dare they say these things? How wrong can they be? Here's how the New York Times editorial actually begins. Quote, given the brittle relations between the Obama administration and Israel, even truth-telling can ignite a firestorm. That happened this week when Daniel Shapiro, Washington's ambassador to Tel Aviv, delivered a speech that drew unfair rebuke from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing government. Unfair from Israel? It is the ambassador's words that are untrue and unfair. How can he even say these things? And how can the New York Times support him? My comments are not blind support for Israel. It's simply an issue of cold details and facts. The New York Times actually continues. Speaking at a security conference, Mr. Shapiro said, correctly, that Israel's quick-moving expansion of settlements on Palestinian lands raises honest questions about Israel's long-term intentions and commitment to a two-state solution. What really enraged his critics was an observation that during a time of increased violence in Israel and the West Bank, too many attacks on Palestinians lack a vigorous investigation or response by Israeli authorities. Too much vigilantism goes unchecked, and at times there seems to be two standards of adherence to the rule of law, one for Israelis and another for Palestinians. A statement from Mr. Netanyahu's office denounced the second comment as unacceptable and incorrect. Here is where my righteous indignation sets in. What world are they in? Listen to these words again. Too many attacks on Palestinians lack vigorous investigation or response by Israeli authorities. Too much vigilantism goes unchecked. The Israelis who attack Palestinian Arabs are investigated. They are prosecuted, and they are almost always convicted. Yes, Israelis are involved, and most of all, these vigilantes are always condemned by the leaders of Israel and the masses of Israel. When has the PA ever tried a terrorist or convicted a terrorist for murdering or plotting to kill Israelis? No. They execute people who are helping Israel. They call them collaborators. The New York Times continues. Considering the relentless violence and attacks on Israel's very existence, Israelis are understandably on high alert to defend themselves. On the day Mr. Shapiro spoke, an Israeli mother of 6 who was killed by Palestinian terrorists was buried, and the pregnant woman was injured in a separate attack. At least the New York Times recognizes Shapiro's timing is off and would only hurt. But here again they continue. But Palestinians have been victims of assaults and acts of vandalism by Jewish extremists, including an arson attack in July that killed a toddler and his parents in the West Bank village of Duma. None of this is acceptable. The criticism of Shapiro, a vigorous advocate of Israel, was unusually personal and unfair. He correctly identified the serious problem. Since 1967, there's been a dual legal system in the West Bank in which Palestinians are subject to military courts, where experts say they are almost always convicted. Israeli settlers fall under the Israeli civilian judicial system, with its greater rights and protections. Yes, there is a different set of rules for the West Bank. Palestinians are not part of Israel, but Israelis are. To make it one law, Israel would have to apply Israeli law there. That would effectively annex the West Bank. What do they want? I do not think the New York Times or the United States State Department have thought this through. And now the New York Times concludes their essay. With only a year left in office, President Obama is unlikely to make another run at the peace process or even apply serious pressure on Israel to halt settlement building. With the Kerry and Shapiro speeches, the administration is hoping to prod Israelis and Palestinians to think hard about the future they are creating. Tragically, it may already be too late for the one formula that has the best chance of establishing a durable peace: two independent states side by side. Sad, weak, and wrong, most notably biased. Comparing several incidents of a few Israeli extremists to hundreds of terror attacks? That's a terrible double standard. Comparing a system of law that honors life and condemns across-the-board violence against Arabs, and not even mentioning the Palestinian culture of death, a culture that is hardly condemned, and when it is, it's always qualified. This editorial and speech are simply irresponsible, both by the New York Times and by Shapiro. Shapiro and the New York Times should know better. Second up is a column from the Wall Street Journal, and it's by Bret Stephens. Stephens is a member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board. He's the deputy editor of the editorial page and writes a column called Global View. He is a lecturer in big demand in the Jewish community, and before this, he briefly served as editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. This column is called Why the U.S. Should Stand by the Saudis Against Iran. Much about the House of Saud is detestable, but that isn't a reason to abandon a vital ally. It was published on January 20th, 2016. Stephens correctly explains that the Saudis are aligned against our enemies, and therefore we should support them. He has identified a huge problem. Stephens begins. There is so much to detest about Saudi Arabia. The kingdom forbids women from driving and bars its doors to desperate Syrian refugees. For years, its cyberitic leaders purchased their legitimacy by underwriting and exporting a bigoted and brutal version of Sunni Islam. Crude oil aside, it's difficult to find much of value produced by the desert kingdom. More recently, the Saudis have increased tensions with Iran by executing, over U.S. objections, a prominent radical Shiite cleric while waging a brutal war against Iran's Shiite proxies in Yemen. So why should the U.S. feel obliged to take sides with the country that Israeli diplomat Dori Gold once called hatred's kingdom, especially when the administration is also trying to pursue further opening with Tehran? This is exactly the problem, and Stephens continues to explain this. That's a question that suddenly seems to be on Washington's liberal foreign policy minds, as if they've just discovered that we don't exactly share Saudi moral values. Some on the right also seem to think that, with the U.S. leading the world in energy production, we no longer have much use for Saudi alliance. Stephens asserts, the U.S. has discarded the Saudis, and I have to tell you, the Saudi leadership knows this. And here is how he concludes and warns the U.S. not to cast the Saudis aside. So, should the U.S. desist from encouraging the kingdom to reform? Of course not. Saudi women were allowed to participate as voters and candidates in municipal elections for the first time in December. That's still a baby step. And the Saudis should use the city-states of Dubai and Abu Dhabi as viable models for political reform. But it's hard for the U.S. to urge such changes on a country that feels it's being abandoned. Foreign alliances are not like wardrobes. You cannot change them on the tide of fashion. America's 71-year alliance with the kingdom is one we abandon at our peril. Stevens is correct. He attacks the U.S. for making very poor foreign policy decisions. The U.S. actually believes that Iran is no longer our enemy. So the entire U.S. paradigm is faulty. And unfortunately, those making decisions do not see the value of a strong alliance with Saudi Arabia. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. We're going to talk about two genres of cartoons today. One genre is called memes. There are stick figures that are based on a character called Bill. They're all over the internet, in almost every society. In English, it's called Bill. In Spanish-speaking countries, by the way, the stick figure is called Jose. The word comes from the Greek. Meme comes from the Greek and the Latin. And there is actually an academic discipline called meme. It means a word or an idea or behavior that spreads throughout a society. Mimic is our closest English word to the Greek and Latin. They use mimesis, to imitate. The Israelis created their own version of Bill, and they have him speaking in Arabic, and his name is Bilal. The memes always have a message. There are two examples here that I want to show you, and then we'll move to the Arabic. In this example, it says the following. This is Bill. Bill wakes up, and it's unusually cold outside, but he does not post it on social media everywhere, since other people have windows too. Bill is smart. Be like Bill. The second example of a meme I want to show you, the meme is sitting at his computer. Bill is on the internet. Bill sees something that offends him. Bill moves on. Bill is smart. Be like Bill. The Arabic one, made by the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, uses the name Bilal. In the Quran, Bilal is the trusted friend and companion of Muhammad. Using his name is brilliant. Here is the dialogue of Bilal. This is Bilal. Bilal bought a knife. Bilal doesn't kill people with the knife. Bilal bought the knife for his father, the cook. Bilal is not a terrorist. Bilal is smart. Be like Bilal. As simple as they look, this is a very sophisticated form of humor. Next up is a set of cartoons by Bob Lang. They're all part of a Special Operations Forces report known as SOFREP. They are very funny, but the audience is special ops people and former and current members. So the humor is raw. The first cartoon is published September 9th, 2015. A huge Trojan horse has rolled up to the walls of Europe. The horse reads, ISIS et al. The horse says, let me in. We're only poor Syrian refugees and stuff. The point is obvious. ISIS members are slipping into Europe under the guise of poor refugees. The second cartoon is also by Bob Lang. It was published January 4th, 2016. A Saudi swordsman is running at an Iranian swordsman. Each is saying death. The Saudi is shouting death to Iran. The Iranian is shouting death to Saudi Arabia as they run at one another. In between them is John Kerry. His head is buried in the sand, and his rump has his name printed on it. Kerry is singing, everything is fine, 'cause you've got a friend. If it was not so true, it would be funny. The U.S. has its head in the sand, and the two parties are out to kill each other. The last cartoon is also by Bob Lang, and is from the SOFREP. It was dated January 10th, 2016. The cartoon depicts two huge mushroom clouds. On the ground near one cloud is the name South Korea. Near the other is Israel. South Korea says, the U.S. State Department assured us that there is nothing to worry about with North Korea's nuke testing. Israel says, they told us the same thing about the Iran nuke deal. Lang is drawing a parallel between the people and what people have been saying and thinking regarding North Korea and Iran. Unfortunately, we see that Iran is learning from North Korea. This is a very dangerous situation. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. This is a stark contrast in societies and in characters. Daphne Meir, a young Jewish mother of 6, was brutally murdered by a 15-year-old Palestinian boy. Daphne was stabbed in the head in front of her house as she was painting trim on her front door. The terrorist struck her so brutally he could not retrieve the knife from her skull. Robbed from the ability to also murder the children who were in the house, he fled. The family, friends, and the nation of Israel is in mourning. Natan, her husband, said this, "We have no anger. I am not angry at anyone. We do not curse Arabs. We are not people who hate." That's not how Daphne and I educated the kids. I spoke with the children yesterday and didn't hear a single bad thing. I talked to them about what we will do now. It's not simple, unquote. When Palestinian terrorists are killed, even when suicide bombers blow themselves up, their families celebrate the suicide and the murderers. Mothers say that they wish all their children would become martyrs. Some say that they will have more children and raise them to become martyrs. Natan and his family are heroes. They're giants. They're an example of strength and humanity in the face of unspeakable tragedy. Frenemy is a combination of words, friend and enemy. Machiavelli could have used this word. It's the perfect way to describe those who live in the Middle East and those outside the Middle East who try to exert influence in the Middle East. Using the word frenemy helps us understand that groups and people are not monolithic, and that some things are complicated and many never are consistent. On one issue, you may be aligned with a particular party or leader or a nation, and on another issue, you may be on the opposite side. That's what happens almost every time with almost every country in the Middle East. Frenemy is an oxymoron. It's also a portmanteau. An oxymoron is an expression in which there's a contradiction within itself, like I see fire, fight for peace. Portmanteau was originally a two-sided trunk. It describes a combination word. The best examples are brunch or motel. Lewis Carroll created the word when he had Humpty Dumpty explaining to Alice the weird words like Jabberwocky, and then he explains slithy, which is lithe and slimy combined. Frenemy is a word I have begun using more and more frequently. China's president addressed the Arab League recently saying that the Chinese support a Palestinian state within the 67 borders. He said, "We are in favor of putting in place a new mechanism to promote peace as to the Middle East question and support efforts made by the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation towards this end." He continued by saying that China firmly supports the Middle East peace process, the establishment of a state of Palestine with full sovereignty on the basis of the 1967 borders and East Jerusalem as its capital. The Chinese president also committed to supporting a solar energy project for the Palestinians and pledged $7.6 million to that end. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquant piece of information. Did you know that the word boycott is named after a man named Charles Boycott? The word was coined in 1880. Boycott was an English land agent working in Ireland. In 1880, there was a movement by the 3 Fs against him. The 3 Fs stood for fixed rent, fixed tenure, and free sale. Mr. Boycott needed to evict people from the large estate owned by Lord Erne. The people refused to deal with Boycott. The issue became a cause célèbre in the English newspapers after Charles Boycott wrote a letter to the editor of the Times. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.